is the architecture of wealth. And I don't mean personal finance. We're talking about the deep underlying systems that actually create and concentrate wealth in our digital age. So how are we going to do that? Well, we've broken this down into 5 core parts. We'll kick things off with the engine that powers it all, then look at the vehicles that capture it. After that, we'll dive into the split between effort and reward, see how the system is actually measured, and wrap up with a look at how AI is acting as a massive accelerator for the whole thing. You've probably heard this idea before, right? It's a really powerful and popular belief that the digital economy has kind of leveled the playing field. The thinking goes that all you need is a laptop and a Wi-Fi connection, and boom, all the old barriers to building wealth just crumble away. But that leads to a really critical question. If the tools to create wealth are supposedly available to pretty much everyone now, why is all the data pointing to wealth concentrating faster than ever? It's a paradox, and that's exactly what we're going to deconstruct here. Okay, let's get into it. The answer, it turns out, doesn't really start with tools. It starts with the engine of it all, leverage. We need to understand the force multipliers that are really at play in today's economy. So what are we even talking about when we say leverage in this context? Well, think of it as any system that disconnects your input from your output. With real leverage, 1 unit of your effort doesn't just produce 1 unit of a result. It could produce 10, 100, 1,000, maybe even 1,000,000. It's what allows for those non-linear, kind of exponential returns. And this is where you see a really critical distinction. On one hand, you've got labor leverage. This requires permission, you need a job, someone has to hire you, and it's linear. Your output is almost always tied directly to your time. But on the other side, you have permissionless leverage. Things like capital and media. You can write code or create content without asking anyone for permission. And here's the kicker. Both can be replicated infinitely at basically 0 marginal cost. This structural difference, it's absolutely fundamental to understanding the whole system. And this quote from Naval Ravikant just illustrates the point perfectly. He frames code as the ultimate permissionless lever. It's like having an army of robots that can work for you 24/7, scaling your judgment and your decisions without ever needing a stamp of approval from any traditional gatekeeper. Okay, so leverage is the engine, but an engine's power is pretty useless unless it's channeled into something, right? And that brings us to our second big idea, the vehicles of capital capture. Think of these as the structural containers designed to hold that force and let it compound over time. Now, you probably recognize a lot of these terms, the Burr method in real estate, things like ETFs, 401ks, but we're not here to talk about them as personal finance tips. That's not the point. We need to analyze them for what they are at a systemic level. They're basically prefabricated vehicles designed specifically to hold assets and compound the power of leverage. So, here's the crucial takeaway from this section. The individual's specific strategy is actually less important than the existence and the choice of the vehicle itself. These containers are a core part of the economic architecture, built to channel the force of leverage and allow it to compound, often with some pretty serious tax advantages baked right in. At a systemic level, their main job is to perform a kind of alchemy. They're designed to take linear, time-bound income, from labor, and transform it into nonlinear, compounding capital that grows all on its own. This conversion process is a central mechanism in the whole architecture of wealth. Okay, so this brings us to a really key dynamic inside the system, the relationship between productivity and what people actually get paid. You could call it the great decoupling of effort from reward. And this chart, which uses data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, shows it so clearly. For decades, you can see labor productivity has just been steadily climbing. Workers are creating more and more value per hour. But look at the other line. Average hourly compensation has stayed relatively flat. There's this massive growing gap between the two. So, where does all that extra value go? It becomes what economists call a surplus. And the underlying logic of the system, especially as it gets accelerated by technology and automation, dictates that this surplus is increasingly captured not by the labor that helped create it, but by the owners of the capital that deployed the technology in the first place. And look, this isn't just a theory or a vague idea. The system has a measured logic. There are specific institutional metrics we can look at to actually quantify the outputs of this whole architecture. One of the big ones is the Gini index. If you look at the data from the St. Louis Fed, you can see a consistent upward trend for the United States. That's a direct indicator of a rising concentration of income. It's not a feeling, it's a direct measurement of what the system is producing. This table here shows the shift even more directly. Look at the trend since 1980. Labor's share of the total gross domestic income has fallen pretty significantly. At the same time, the share that's captured by corporate profits has gone up. This isn't just a cyclical blip. It's a structural shift that's been happening for decades, changing how the economic pie is divided. And it's important to know that this analysis isn't just pulled out of thin air. It's all based on robust institutional data. Sources like the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, the World Inequality Database, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. These are the very mechanisms used by economists and policymakers to measure and understand these massive, large-scale economic structures. All right, so now we introduce the most powerful new element into this entire architecture: artificial intelligence. And we're going to analyze it not as some great democratizing force, but as what it really is within this system: a reinforcement layer. So AI's primary role in this system is as a huge leverage multiplier. It enhances the power of the leverage that already exists. The thing is, its effect is totally asymmetrical. It dramatically increases the efficiency, the scale, and the decision-making speed for capital to a much, much greater degree than it does for labor. Here's how that breaks down. First, it amplifies the scalability of capital. Second, it systematically reduces the need for human labor input for every unit of output. Third, it increases the information and decision asymmetry, basically the gap between those who have the AI models and those who don't. And fourth, it reinforces the existing advantages of those who already control the capital and the data infrastructure to begin with. So let's put it all together. Let's synthesize this architecture. First, leverage determines scale. The type of leverage you can access, permissioned or permissionless, is what really sets the ceiling for your potential economic scale. Second, ownership determines capture. Simply put, owning the assets held within these structural vehicles we talked about, that's what determines who actually gets to keep the surplus value that's created. And finally, AI accelerates the asymmetry. It acts as this incredibly powerful accelerator, just widening the gap between those two dynamics. It multiplies the power of scaled leverage, and it reinforces the capture mechanisms of ownership. What it does is accelerate the underlying asymmetry of the entire system. And that is the architecture.